Good evening. He said change, or Lorna said change, so I figured I'd switch that up a little. Sorry if I get a little loud or anything. I'm not used to wearing the mic, so my voice is about half gone already from worship, so we'll just see what God does. So, again, like Cody said, I was preparing this message for the jail, but it seems like after this morning and after countless number of God, is this a yes or is this a no, and not hearing anything over the past, 22 hours, I wasn't sure, and the guys in the jail know what I'm talking about, but after I got ready this morning, I was going to come to morning prayer. I kid you not. As soon as I walked out of the bathroom, I heard a train whistle. So that was the beginning of the confirmation. I haven't talked to Josh since Friday, but Sunday school was all over it. Tanya said some stuff. Worship was all over it. So, all right, God. If y'all have y'all Bibles, we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 4. Pretty familiar scripture, but again, we'll just see where God takes it. So early this week, when I was praying for the jail service, I didn't really have much. Billy had asked me to, wherever he went, I don't know where he went, there he is. He asked me to, he had asked me to preach for him because he had make up softball games and stuff. So I began to pray, and again, just kind of felt like God was kind of being silent, like usual. I was watching. Anybody ever seen the movie Friday Night Lights? Show of hands. Anybody? Okay, we got like 6 people that's seen the movie. It's a movie about Texas football, which is almost as strong as Kentucky basketball. But it was before one of their first games. You know how before you go to play a sport, the coach always gives a pep talk. He always gives that, let's get ready, let's get in there, let's stay focused, let's go kind of pep talk. Well, that's what was going on in the foreground of the movie, but my attention got drawn to the background of the movie. And before, over top, like the exit doors in locker rooms, a lot of times the teams, coaches will write this big, awesome, like one-liner kind of thing that, they go through and smack the wall before they go out for some reason. But the one-liner that was on the wall in that movie, in that moment, really hit me. And God began to stir that in my spirit. And the one-liner that was written on the wall was that if you want the victory, you have to be prepared for the fight. And like I said, that just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't even anything in the movie. It was a background piece. And if you want the victory, you have to be prepared for the fight. So I began to ponder that around in my mind and began to pray on it. And God was just faithful, like He always is. And while I was throwing it around in my mind, God gave me this other kind of one-liner to go with that one-liner. So, victory is about making the choices that you don't want to make now in order to live in the freedom that you want later. So you hear us talk about a lot of times that in our devotion, in our lifestyle that we live, that it's a process. And when we go through the process, we have all these different choices and different battles we have to face. So victory is about making the choices that you don't really want to make now in order to live in the freedom that you want later. And when we dig into Nehemiah chapter 4, we're going to see a lot of these choices that Nehemiah has to make whenever they're rebuilding the wall. As we dig into the scripture, I'm not sure how much of it we'll get into. The other night I read like 17 chapters, but all right. I'm in the New Living Translation. That's what I got. Sanballat was very angry when he learned that they were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices?" And God highlighted the last part of that verse. What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? So, like I said in the beginning, that victory is what we're striving towards in everything. Seems like a lot today we've been talking about victory. We've been talking about striving to get to that victory. And you heard me talk about the train whistle. Josh, is for you. Friday night, I called it the process train. So it was whenever you declare you're at point A, you declare that you're going for the victory, and you have to get from point A to point B. Your victory is at point B, but you're still stuck here at point A. And in between, we got this thing called the process train, where these different things, these different choices that come up in our lives through the process that we have to make the right decision, we have to follow God, we have to seek God throughout all these different things. That's jumping ahead. But the first thing that I think the enemy likes to do is whenever we start declaring our victory from point A to get to point B, we start declaring our victory, and the enemy likes to tell us that we're poor and we're feeble. We ain't nothing but a bunch of broken down people. The things in our past are going to hold us down and keep us from ever reaching point B, which is where the victory lies. We're not ever going to be able to make it. That we are absolutely nothing. It's exactly what the enemy wants us to think. And that's the first train that we come to, I guess the caboose, if you will, that we come to whenever we just start to declare our victory and we start to strive towards point A. We get on the train, we're going to point B. The enemy likes to tell us that we're never going to make it there. That's the first lie that he wants to get embedded in our spirit, is that we're never going to make it there, because then we won't try. And then going on in verse 2, it says, "Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap, and charred ones at that?" Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap, and charred ones at that? And that's just the enemy continuing on into that lie, that you ain't nothing but a broken down wall. You ain't nothing but a broken down pile of junk that God's never going to be able to make into anything stable again. And the enemy wants us to think that we're going to continue to be unstable. And so if we begin with the lie that we're unstable, we begin with the fact that the enemy thinks we're poor and we're feeble, then when we continue to try to build on that, our mind is going to continually go back to the fact that we're unstable and we're going to fall. And then I like how it says that the rubbish heap was charred. It was charred at that. A lot of times, everyone knows that we go through fire. We go through all kinds of junk from the enemy. And that a lot of time leaves us charred. And that's one of the things that the enemy likes to play on, is our scars. The things that have charred us, the things that's left us bruised and broken. Because we can pick ourselves up and we can dust ourselves off, but we're going to continue going on with those scars. We're going to continue going on with those burn marks. We're going to continue to try to get to the victory, but we still have this thing that's on our arm. We still have this thing that's on our hearts and our minds. And that's what the enemy tries to play on. Anytime we continue to make that step forward, he always wants to remind us that we have a past. He wants to remind us that he's burned us down before. In verse 3, it says, "Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, 'The stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it.'" Pay attention to number 4. "Then I prayed, 'Hear us, our God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders.'" So we was in worship in the jail Friday night and did that song, "Do It Again." And it was like one of those things, like God hit me like a ton of bricks with the chorus. It talks about Him being faithful, and we are in His hands. And so, if God was the one that created us from the beginning, I think we can agree on that we are created by God, we're created in His image, and we're created by His hands. He breathed His life into us, and we grew up. That's how it works. So if us being in His hand in the beginning, from the beginning, before we knew anything that our life would ever hold, if us being in His hand from the beginning could know that, He is the God and He's going to carry us then, even though we didn't know that then, but when we get here now, we should still know that we are in His hands. And then the next verse of the song, the next part of the song says, He is faithful. I got that mixed up, but He is faithful. So anytime you come into anything that you can't handle, anytime you come into these lies that the enemy's trying to put on you, the first step in the old train here, the first choice that you have to make is to pray to God, like it says in verse 4. It's what Nehemiah did. Pray to God, and to not accept those lies in your life. To not accept what the enemy's trying to plant into your life. And so that's where whenever I talked about victory being the choices that we don't really want to make now, how many times do we get in that mode of where the enemy is beating us down, the enemy has filled us with all these lies, the enemy has fed all this stuff into our mind, and that's all we can see. So in that point, we begin to get depressed, we begin to get down on ourselves. Just talking about me, I begin to get down on myself, and then I begin to think there's no hope, there's no way I'll ever make it. I'm just going to go ahead and get off the train now because I'm never going to make it to point B. And then I begin to get just down and depressed, and that's exactly what the enemy wants. But like I said, God is faithful. So if He had us in His hands in the beginning, He's definitely got us in His hands now, even more so than He had at the beginning. And He's faithful and loyal to see us through to the end. So if we make that choice, the choice we might not really want to make, to press in and to not believe the lies, because it's 10 times easier to believe the lies that the enemy has than it is to try to believe the truth. Because all we've ever been spoken to a lot of times is the lies. That's all we've ever opened our ears to, so it's kind of hard to open your ears to the truth. And that's a choice that you might not want to make, because I know a lot of times you try to people, especially in the jail, a lot of times you try to tell people that they're a lot more than what they see in the mirror. They're a lot more than what they give themselves credit for, and they can't believe it. Because all they've been told is a lie, and a lot of times they don't choose to believe it. And so we have to make those choices that we don't really want to make now to live in the freedom that we want to later. Lost my track. In verse 6, it says, At last the wall was completed to half its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. I'm going to read that again. Really pay attention. At last the wall was completed to half its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. And God really highlighted this verse to me. And at first I didn't really know why, because it's just, cool. They got half the wall done, and they're, woo, got half the wall done. We're getting there. But God highlighted this to me, and it was like, this is another thing. Satan is really is more okay with you starting your path and gaining your victory than he is with you not doing anything. Because whenever you're not doing anything, he's already got you. Like you're already, like Terry always says, you're going backwards. So if you're not doing anything, you're going backwards. But once you take that, the unction to look and say, I'm claiming my victory, I'm going to get on the train, I'm going to start going through the process, I'm going to start getting things right, things are starting to work out, things are starting to come along the way it needs to. The wall is getting built the way I think it should. Everything's happening the way that I think it absolutely should. We begin to build hope. We begin to build, we can get this light at the end of the tunnel kind of thing. We think that maybe we can make it. And the enemy is absolutely okay with that, because then what he does is he comes through and he cuts the legs right out from underneath us. He is absolutely okay with you doing okay for a little while, because that begins to build strength in yourself, so he can just come along and crush it every single time. And we see that happening here because they had built the wall, half the wall, with enthusiasm, and then Nehemiah starts to hear that, or once the enemy in the surrounding cities and stuff begin to hear that the wall is actually being rebuilt, they begin to send letters and they begin to make plans to fight against Nehemiah in Jerusalem. They begin to make plans to come in and try to tear down the wall. And so in getting ahead of myself. In verse 8, they all made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion. So like we've seen, they had built half the wall and they were excited. They were enthused. They thought things were going well. And then the enemy began to plot against them and began to come in and cut their legs out from underneath them, which is what the enemy really wants to do to us a lot of the times. Even more so than us not doing anything. He wants to try to crush our hope, because that'll take us a lot deeper into not believing the truth than not ever doing anything will. And so in verse 9, and this is where they make the kind of the choice in the process, it says, "But we prayed to our God and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves." So they made the choice that whenever the enemy tried to come against them and tear them down like he always does, inevitably the enemy always comes at us and tries to tear us down. They made a choice that they was going to trust in God. They was going to have that blind faith. And they guarded the city day and night to protect themselves. So that's a choice that you have to make when the enemy comes against you. You have to, come to a choice inside yourself. Am I going to sit here and be afraid of the enemy and go back to the place where I'm going to take a step off the train? Or am I going to hold on tighter to the rail and I'm going to dig in and I'm going to keep going with everything I got? Because that's exactly what they did. They protected the city. They guarded the city day and night. So they dug in and they prayed to God and they trusted God and they believed in God instead of believing in the lie of the enemy. It's another step in the process. And they was able to continue to press on and go on with the building of the wall. Verse 10, it says, "Then the people of Judah began to complain. The workers are getting tired. There's so much rubble to be moved. We will never be able to build the wall by ourselves." That's another thing the enemy wants to try to get us into a place that we think that we're all alone. Think that there's nobody else that's trying to help me. There's nobody else that's ever been through the same problem that I'm going through right now. Ain't nobody else as bad as I am. I'm just in a place all by myself. I'm the absolute worst of the worst. I'm never going to reach that victory. I'm never going to get to the other side. And that's, again, exactly what the enemy wants. He wants to continue to crush our hopes. He wants to make, when we go to get started on the path of the process, we know that we're not perfect. We're not perfect people, and obviously the process is made to cut off stuff. The process in the wilderness is made for us to go through so we can be prepared for what God has us in the victory. So we begin to go through those things, and the enemy wants to try to get us thinking that all this stuff, the entire rest of the train, all the way to the process, is too much. I got too much junk in my life. I am not going to be able to get rid of it to ever get to the victory. And he wants to make us think that we're absolutely the worst of the worst, so we'll never continue to build and to strive and to press in, which is what God wants us to do. In number 12, it says, "The Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and attack us." The Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and attack us. So that was one thing I think God really pointed out to me and highlighted to me in the jail. But I think it's just as important here. And I know we know all the time, it's said all the time that the enemy is put here to kill, steal, and destroy. That's what he's supposed to do. But I'm here to tell you again, the enemy is here to kill, steal, and destroy. When we begin to step foot on that train, we begin to step foot into the process, we begin to step foot into drawing nigh to God and getting closer to God, then the enemy comes at us and it surrounds us on all sides. He comes at us from all different fronts. Every possible thing that he could ever use to come against us, he's going to try to use against us. So I'm telling you, Whenever you step foot into the process, the enemy is going to attack. If you want the victory, you have to be prepared for the fight. And this is the other choice, one of the other choices in the process, number 13. So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in exposed areas. I stationed the people to stand guard by families, armed with swords, spears, and bows. So I want you to notice that he placed the armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. So each and every single one of us have the charred spots like we were talking about before. We have those spots that the enemy has beaten us down before. We've let the enemy rule over in our lives. It could even be the spots that we begin to believe the lies of the enemy. We begin to believe the lies that he's feeding into our heads, so that becomes a weak spot in your wall, so to speak. It becomes a weak spot in what you're trying to build and what you're trying to grow on, because the enemy knows that's the spot he's going to try to get in the most. So Nehemiah stationed the people to stand guard by families. What are we? We're family. You guys, I've been here for a long time, and you guys are the best family I've ever had. I want each and every one of you to know that. You guys are the best family I've ever had. Sometimes even more so than my own, but I want you to know that you guys are my family. Whenever I talk about family, you guys are what I mean when I talk about family. It's each and every one of you guys that's sitting out here. And what Nehemiah did, he made the choice to station people by families. So whenever each and every one of us have those weak parts, we can go to somebody else in the family, and the person in the family that's strong in that area can fight for us. He puts those people in our lives that have the words of knowledge. They have the words of wisdom. They've been there. They've done that. They've dealt with that a million times. So they can help you through this part. They can help you in this area that's exposed. And that's what God wants to do in the church family. God wants us, we're all building a wall. We're all going towards the victory. We're all trying to get to point, we're all doing the same thing. We're getting to point B. That's what we're all striving for. And we should all want to see each other make it to point B. We should all want to see each other's wall be built. But if we have to be honest with ourselves, each and every one of us have a weak spot. We have a spot that the enemy comes at us. Anytime we try to do anything good for God, we try to get any closer to God, that's the first thing that the enemy brings at us is that weak spot. You might even thought that you got it taken care of a million times before, but he will still bring that weak spot up against you. And that's why we're supposed to fight together. That's why we're stationed here as a family. That's why each and every one of y'all are here, because I don't believe that y'all are here for just out of coincidence or for no reason. Each person that's in this house today is here for a reason. It's because y'all are part of the family, whether you're a visitor or whether you've been here for 85 years, Danny. We're all sent here for a reason. We're all here to fight for each other, and that's exactly what we have to do. And that's a choice that we have to make in the process, because a lot of times I don't want to share my weakness. A lot of times I've just dealt with this thing, and I told people that I got it taken care of, and then here it comes again, so it's going to make me look like I'm terrible at trying to be a Christian. I'm terrible at trying to do this. So I'm just not going to share my weakness at all. I'm going to continue to put on that mask. I'm going to continue to put on that facade and continue to let that enemy come into my life and control that area of my life instead of ever getting it taken care of. Whenever someone else could hold the key to you getting over that. And a lot of times we don't want to fight for other people. We get in our own little funk, we get in our own little rut, so to speak, and we're just doing the best we can do to survive, and that's all we can do for the moment, because I don't know anything that's going on, whenever God has called us to fight for each other. So if you're in a moment that you really have no idea what's going on, maybe you're supposed to be fighting for somebody else. We're meant to be family, guys. It's the ecclesia. And we have to fight for each other. Have to fight for each other. It's important. And going on in verse 14. Then as I looked over the situation, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people and said to them, "Don't be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord, who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So remember I told you earlier that in verse 12 the enemy is going to attack. The enemy is absolutely going to come against you anytime you try to take a step closer to God. Don't be afraid of the enemy. When the enemy is nothing but a puffed up person that don't know anything but lies. That's all he's good at. He's like that little cat, little kitten that's talking smack to like a big lion. And it sounds like a big lion, but you look and it's just a little kitten. That's all it is. That's all the enemy really is. So don't be afraid of the enemy. We only ever become afraid of the enemy because we put our eyes on the enemy. We look at the attacks. We give him credit for everything he's doing, and we're just lifting him up. We're allowing him space into our lives. We're allowing him to come into the weak points. What we have to do, going on in verse 14, it says, remember the Lord who is great and glorious. So first thing we have to do to not be afraid of the enemy is we got to take our eyes off the enemy and we begin to look at the Lord. We got to remember that God is faithful. We got to remember that the Lord is great and glorious. We got to remember that God's going to hold us, and we're in His hands, like we said before. So He's going to be faithful to carry us out through everything that we could ever come against. Everything that we could ever come against. God wants you to get through anything you're fighting through more than you want to get through anything you're fighting through. So why would God not carry you through what you're going through? It may look like He's a million miles away, but that's just because you have your eyes set on the enemy and not because you're looking at Him. It says, remember the Lord who is great and glorious. That's the first thing we got to do, is just to look on God, to set our gaze towards God. And that's what helps us get to the victory. That's what helps us get to our train all the way through the process to the victory, is by keeping our eyes on God, not looking at the enemy. Because ultimately the different choices that come up that we have to make is because we take our eyes off of God for a second and we look at what the enemy's got going on, then we have to make a choice. It's like, ooh. Like Terry was talking about earlier, that fishing lure, like, man, that over there looks real good. This process doesn't look good at all. It looks pretty dry, pretty dry and barren. That over there, that looks good. And that's what we begin to do. That's what derails our train. That's what takes us off the track, is because we begin to put our focus on the diversions and we don't look at God, who's trying to get us to come on towards the victory. Put some more coal in the train, guys. Let's go. Come on. He wants you to dig in. He wants you to put the coal on the train. He wants you to get to the victory more than you want to get to the victory. But we only ever become afraid of the enemy if we take our eyes off of Jesus and put our eyes on the enemy. And then it says to fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. That comes back, fight for your family. Fight for the ecclesia. Fight for your family at home. Fight for your brothers and sisters. Fight for all the people that we're supposed to be sharing this journey with, instead of creating a million different denominations and we'll fight for those people. Fight for each other. That goes back to standing in the gap for people. I think that if we were more worried about helping somebody else fill their gaps, our gaps are going to be taken care of. Every time. Every time. If we're more worried about filling the gap for somebody else, our gap will always be covered, because they're worried about filling your gap, you're worried about filling their gap, and they're worried about filling somebody else's gap. So if we remember to fight for each other like we're supposed to and hold each other up like we're supposed to, then our homes, the things that we're dealing with, are going to be protected. God's got us. And in verse 15 it says, when our enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to work on the wall. So once the enemy realizes that you ain't going to give him no credit, you ain't going to look at him, you ain't even going to acknowledge that he's, other than trying to, I'm not dealing with that right now, I'm just set straight towards the victory, set straight towards the promise. That's what we're going towards. So I'm not going to give him any credit or give him a second glance. So then we return to track. The enemy's not even a problem. We just keep going. It's kind of funny. It just kind of came to mind. You watch those old westerns where the train robbers on the horses are riding beside the train. So what's kind of happening here is the train's going down the track. Satan's the horses trying to come and get you, but then we went through a cave. That's exactly what's happened. The horses have got to stop. They can't go nowhere. So that's what happens to the enemy every time. God frustrates the enemy by putting a cave in the way, so... Whoop. Anyway, it's how it works in my mind. Verse 16. From then on, only half the men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah. So, we got to remember, if you want the victory, you have to be prepared for the fight. So you always got to be aware that the enemy can come at you at any moment. But I'm not saying look at the enemy whenever he comes at you. I'm not saying give him any more credit than he's worth. But I'm saying you have to be, it's common sense, you have to be aware that the enemy is going to come against you. So half the men worked while the other half stood guards with spears. That goes back to standing in the gap for each other. There's going to be some times where you're working and you're striving, you're getting on that process, and then sometimes you're going to have to be doing that for somebody else. You're going to have to be guarding them, praying for them, lifting them up while they're doing their own process. It's just how it works. And so we go on down. This entire time while they're building the rest of the wall, they already completed half the wall. So the entire time while they're striving to get the rest of the wall fixed, they keep coming against enemy after enemy. They keep sending letters. They keep doing all this stuff. And one thing that God highlighted to me again was in verse 20. Whenever you hear the blast of the trumpet, rush to wherever it's sounding, then our God will fight for us. So what you got to get about Jerusalem is Jerusalem was a huge city. And it goes on to explain that it was so big that the families and everything that he had stationed at the different places in the wall were all spread out really far apart. And so whenever the enemy would come to try to attack this certain group, like if the enemy come to try to attack Cody, he's building this part of the wall, Cody would grab his trumpet out, or whoever got the trumpet in his little group and his family, they'd blow the trumpet, and then everybody else that was working on the wall would come to that one spot and help them fight the enemy. And that again shows us how we have to stand in the gap for each other. That goes all the way back to the enemy trying to put the lie into your head that you're not worth fighting for. The enemy putting the lie in your head that you're never going to get it, and your situation is not worth mentioning to anybody else. That's the lie that he wants you to get, so then this doesn't happen. Because the enemy will try to come at you, and if he can get you one-on-one, a lot of times it's a lot easier for him to pull you down than you to pull him up, that old, and then he's got you. Whereas if Cody blew the trumpet and I come running, Penny tried to go tackle Cody, well, we're going to stop Penny because we're two people and she's one. So the enemy tries to come at us in these different areas. We blow our trumpet, the family comes and fights for us, and the enemy doesn't know what hit him. He has to flee. The wall's still built. The wall's still being built. You're still in the process because half of them stood guard, half of them worked. But whenever they came and they fought for each other, they were still on the process towards the victory, and nobody had derailed, nothing had happened. Everybody's still striving to get to the same spot. Everybody's still getting towards the victory. So, like I said a while ago, we go on through like 3 or 4 chapters here, and it's just about them trying to build the wall, the enemy coming to attack. They fight off the enemy. They try to build the wall. The enemy coming to attack. They, fight off the enemy. All this, it keeps kind of going on. And in chapter 6, we find out that they had finally built the wall, but the only thing that remained was the doors and the gates and everything. It's in verse 3. Oh, what had happened in chapter 6, they finally got the wall built and the gates is still left standing. One of the enemy people of the villages tried to meet with Nehemiah, and Nehemiah would never go. And he kept asking back and forth. And then this is what Nehemiah says when the guy asked him to go. It says, "So I replied," it's in verse 3, "I replied by sending this message to them. I am engaged in a great work, and I cannot come. Why should I stop working to come and meet with you?" So again, whenever the enemy comes to attack us, he begins to bring these things up against us. We have to make the choice to either entertain the enemy and what he has to offer, or we can choose to continue to press on towards the victory. We can choose to keep going through the process. And it's all these little choices that we have to make as we go along. Because the enemy, whenever something big happens to us, it's kind of a lot easier to trust in God. Because it's something big. It's out of our control usually most of the time. And whenever something like that happens, a lot of times it can turn us closer to God, whether against the enemy. But what the enemy likes to try to do, and I'm sure a lot of people can attest to this, it's all the little things throughout the process. That the enemy tries to come against us with lies or this or that, whatever it may be, that we have to continue to make the choice. A lot of times it's the choice that we don't want to make, but to be able to live in that freedom of the victory, we have to make those choices to get through the process. And so remembering each other in prayer and fighting for each other is a good way to help people along through the process and the little stuff. Because I know Tyler and them have been focused a lot on accountability with the youth. And I think that's a good thing for the adults as well. Because like when we fill in that gap for each other, the enemy can't get to us. But if we don't take the initiative to try to tell somebody else what's going on in our lives, and the enemy can just rule our lives. He can just, a lot of times, he can use those little things that continue to just turn us off, like we're going through the process and we're jumping the train cars or, going throughout the train. Well, what he begins to do, we might be all the way up here into the locomotive, the cab part, whatever you can call it. And he's going to get us one thing after another. We might still be going straight, but then there's one thing that we've allowed him to come in, and we start moving back cars. This little thing happened. I don't feel like praying today, so we move back a car. I got all this stuff going on in my life. I'm choosing not to believe the truth today. I'm going to choose to believe that I'm unworthy, and I'm going to allow all this stuff to come into my life, and I'm going to keep going back a car. Till eventually we find ourselves derailed, and we're no longer going towards a victory. We're just doing our best to survive. So, in verse 9 in chapter 6, it says they were just trying to intimidate us, imagining that they could discourage us and stop the work. So I continued to work with even greater determination. So the enemy's goal was to try to come at us and break us down and derail us and try to intimidate us. But remember, we don't need to be afraid of the enemy. But he comes at us with everything he's got. Like it says in 4:12, they come in time and time again to say the enemy was going to attack. He comes at us time and time again. And what we have to do, we have to keep our eyes focused on Jesus and keep going towards the promise, towards the victory. And so whenever they come at us to try to discourage us, we have to continue the work with even greater determination. Instead of letting ourselves be discouraged whenever the enemy comes against us, we need to use that and let it fuel us to get to the next car. Let it fuel us to get it to the next point in the destination through the process to get to the victory. I know this is what everybody's been waiting for. In chapter 6, verse 15, so on October 2nd, the wall was finished. Just 52 days after we had begun. And this is one of the things that God highlighted to me, and it wasn't until we got into the jail Friday night that I seen this. But I began to tell them, have y'all ever noticed whenever they go to build something here in Campbellsville, it takes them like 3 years to build something? Like that even New Journey over there feels like they've been building on that church for like ever. But it says that they built the entire wall in 52 days. To me, that's insane because it talks about how big Jerusalem was and how spread apart they were, but they finished the work in 52 days. So that begins to show me that I don't have to look at the enemy when he comes to derail me. I don't have to give the enemy any credit, and my process doesn't have to be as long as I make it. Your process doesn't have to be as long as you make it be. Your process is only as long as you make your own process. That makes sense. So, like, if we begin to let the enemy derail us and veer us from path to path, then obviously, like we talked about a while back, God has to write our story back into where it needs to go. So once we kind of derail and we go this way or this way, God has to write us back into here. Well, if we let the enemy come back again and get us this way and this way, then we have to be written back here. Therefore, the process takes however long it takes to get you to the victory. But it can be quick. Just 52 days after they had begun, they built the wall, they finished the wall. So your process can be quick if you just keep your focus on Jesus, if you keep your focus on the one that can keep you going, the one that, when our enemies surround us, the one that comes and surrounds us and takes care of our enemies. If we begin to put our trust in Him, we have that blind faith. We walk out the way we're supposed to walk it out, and then we get to the victory a lot quicker than if we keep giving the enemy credit and listen to all the diversions and different things like that. That's all I got, guys.